Would you like me to seduce you?
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.
Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, he walks into mine.
Why rum always?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
It's a trap.
Every town has an Elm Street.
Trust no one, Mr. Miller.
Nice night for a walk.
Groovy.
Hey guys, welcome to the Celluloid Fiends podcast. I'm your host, Mo Long. You can follow us at Celluloid Fiends on Facebook and Twitter, as well as Celluloid Fiends Pod on Instagram. And if you want to follow me, you can follow me at Mitchell C. Long on Twitter and Instagram, as well as read my film reviews at cupofmo.com. And you can check out my tech website, techuplife.com. And we have a special guest in the studio today.
What's up, Celluloid Fiends? This is Wes Clifton. I'm a writer, I'm a film buff, I'm a musician, but I am not an engineer. You can check me out on Instagram at Cliff Weston. If you want to check out some of my fiction writing, I actually have a new story coming out in July. It's a Western story, my first published Western story. You can check out my writing at my website, WD Clifton, D as in for Dale, wdclifton.wordpress.com. And in terms of music, I always have different projects going on. Right now, some friends and I went back and found a bunch of recordings from my old punk band from the early 2000s. We were called Brentwood, and we just basically put those all out for free for anybody who wants to listen because they're so old. So that's brentwood.bandcamp.com.
Oh, heck yeah. I'm going to check that out. And congrats on the upcoming Western
Thank you.
that you're going to have published.
Thank you very much. I remember the last time I was on the podcast talking about it, and then it's taken a little while, but it's finally coming out. So
I am super excited for that. And it is always a pleasure to have you on the show. Is this your third time on the show?
Third time's a charm.
Heck yeah. Wes from the beginning has just been, one of our biggest fans, one of our biggest supporters. So, really appreciate all that support. Not just in you coming on the show, but you're always texting me after the episodes go up, and Wes is actually responsible for our Instagram account. So thank you very much to you for that, buddy.
Yeah, I love. I was telling you earlier, I love Instagram like I'm a middle school girl or something. So I might as well.
Well, when you're on lockdown, gotta stay entertained somehow.
Oh yeah.
And tonight we are talking about the 1975 classic Deep Red, and this was a Wes pick.
Yeah.
So before we get into some details, why did you end up picking this film?
So I'm going to try not to talk about the pandemic very much because what a bummer, but I will mention, it's hard not to talk about it, and I'll mention our state, North Carolina, has been on stay at home for the past month and a half, 2 months or so, and so in order to kind of pass the time, I have been delving into Italian horror movies and Gialli in particular. It's something I've always had an interest in, Italian horror, ever since undergrad. But I've just never really taken a huge deep dive. And so I've been watching a lot of movies, and one of the first ones that I watched during all this was Deep Red. It was a first time watch for me, and I was just so struck by it. I believe I texted you like the same night or the very next day and was like, dude, we have to talk about this movie.
I don't think I realized, though, that this was your first watch.
Yeah. And then I watched it again for the podcast. So I've watched it twice now, but I had never seen it before like a month ago. Yeah.
It has just infinite replay value.
Yes.
There's so much to take in here. So this is a great pick. And you said you were having a deep dive into Giallo. So I guess you're having a deep red dive.
Deep red dive
into Giallo.
Yes,
sir. So this movie was directed by Dario Argento, and it was co-written by Dario Argento and Bernardino Zapponi. I probably mispronounced his last name there.
We'll probably do that a lot.
Oh yeah. Like stay tuned guys for us to mispronounce every single name that we throw out here. It made $629,903 at the US box office, and it has a 96% critic rating and an 86% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. And I'm actually a little curious, what do you think of those scores?
The Rotten Tomato scores?
Yes.
Dude, I don't want to spoil how I'm going to talk about this movie for the rest of the podcast, but I think they're well deserved. I mean, this movie is a masterpiece, man. I love this movie. Watching it again today, like you said, it was just the replay value. I was not at all bored. I watched it very recently, and it just something about this movie, man. It's a special movie. I remember looking at that 96% critics on Rotten Tomatoes. I was kind of surprised just because usually if I like something, the critics don't. But this movie I know has a really good reputation, and I think it's well deserved.
I 100% agree with you. I think it's very well deserved. The one I was slightly surprised about was the audience score, because on the one hand, I think there are a lot of people like us who are pretty big fans of the genre and of Argento films, but I also feel like it's one of those special films that it takes a certain kind of audience member to appreciate.
Yeah, it's a little off the beaten path for like a mainstream American horror fan or even thriller fan.
Totally. So this movie starts out at Christmas time, and I guess you could say the beginning is Christmas adjacent.
Oh yeah.
And you see a pair of shadowy figures struggling, and then a child screams, and a blood-soaked knife falls to the floor by the child's feet. And then it cuts to present day, and psychic Helga Ullmann, portrayed by Maka Merrill, sorry there for mispronouncing your name, gives a speech where she predicts that a member of the audience is a killer. Later in the evening, Helga hears a children's song and then is brutally murdered. And jazz musician Marcus Daly, David Hemmings, witnesses the murder while walking home and rushes to the scene of the crime, but it's too late. Once the police arrive, Marcus notices that a painting in the apartment seems to have vanished mysteriously. Reporter Gianni Brezzi, Daria, I'm not even going to pronounce her last name there because I'm going to botch it, shows up to cover the killing. Brezzi's article the next day outs Marcus as the chief witness in the investigation, and after narrowly escaping the killer, Gianni and Marcus team up to investigate. So you mentioned you watched this movie twice. So what was the time frame between your two watches?
Yeah, I think I watched it the first time right around the beginning of April, and this is mid-May now, so about a month and a half apart. Yeah.
And did your opinion at all change, or did you kind of view it differently on the second watch?
You know, it didn't really change that much because, like I said, the first time I watched it, I was just so struck by it. It was in my head for days, and I texted you about it almost immediately. And then today, once again, watching it, I was just amazed by how wonderful it was. Now, since then, the only things that have changed really are that I won't say it was the first Giallo that I'd ever seen, because you and I and Kenny went to see Tenebrae at the Carolina, and then I had also seen A Bay of Blood, Mario Bava's Bay of Blood. But I've seen several more Gialli since then, let's just say, in my little deep dive here. And also, I think watching it a second time, I think that knowing where the plot was headed helped me to kind of put together the pieces a little better. It's one of those movies, and I don't say this as an insult, but it's one of those movies where the plot is very complex. And the first time I watched it, I was thinking like that maybe certain parts seemed a little disjointed, and I was having a little bit of a hard time following the narrative. But this time, kind of knowing where everything was going, it all fit together much better. And I will say, just while it's on my mind, because I'm waging a one-man war against spoilers, that for any listeners that may be new to the show, this is a mystery story, and I'm sure that we are going to give away everything as this episode goes on. So if you've not seen it, I hate when people say this on podcasts, but seriously, if you've not seen it, just pause us right now and go watch Deep Red. It's on Amazon Prime, and it's well worth your time.
Yeah, that's a good point. And kind of dovetailing off what you were saying there, I think this was maybe my third watch of this movie because I watched it the first time on DVD. I caught it at, I think it was playing at a retro actually. And then I watched it again earlier this week. And I had this interesting experience where when I was watching it this week, I realized the first time I watched this movie, I had no idea where it was going. And a lot happens in this movie, lot. And like you, the first time I watched it, I thought this is kind of disjointed. And I realized while watching it this time that it sort of puts you into the shoes of someone investigating the murder as it's going on. You're kind of along the ride with Gianni and Marcus, and you're trying to figure out who the killer is. And then if you watch a subsequent time, that time you're able to actually kind of pick up the clues, and you have these gotcha moments as you're proceeding through the film.
Yeah. It reminds me, I mean, while I'm heaping high praise in this film, it reminds me of when I was much younger and I first got into the Godfather franchise. And like, the Godfather obviously the plot is so complicated. And I remember having to watch that movie so many times before everything clicked. And honestly, I really appreciated that about the movie because it was layered enough to give me pleasure through multiple watchings of the Godfather. And I feel like this movie was kind of the same. Like, as I was watching it today, it wasn't boring. I was seeing it from a whole new perspective, and it's complex enough in a good way to keep it entertaining and keep it a fun watch.
Absolutely. And that's a really interesting comparison, The Godfather, because I think this probably gets compared to a lot of other Argento films and Giallo films, but yeah, that's one I don't think I would have thought initially to compare it to, but I think that's pretty fitting.
Just the complexity is all, yeah, right.
And I think from a technical perspective, this is just really a masterpiece, and it definitely has that Argento vibe to it, because there's that score by Goblin, and it's very avant-garde.
Yeah.
And I think one of my favorite scenes was actually kind of towards the end when Marcus is exploring the dilapidated mansion, and there's just this really funky bass line going.
It's going crazy the whole time. So the bass player from Goblin, and I was born and raised in the American South, so people are just going to expect me to butcher Italian names. But Fabio Pignatelli is the bass player for Goblin at that time, and actually I guess for most of the time for Goblin, and his bass lines really drive a lot of this movie, honestly. Like the score, anyway.
Oh yeah, my surround sound was thumping.
Yes.
I was surprised I did not get a noise complaint from the neighbors when that happened. And I think for me, one thing that makes this movie really visually captivating and also at some points tough to watch are just the kills.
Yeah.
They're really brutal. They're really creative. But one thing I appreciate a lot is the camera work is so dynamic that it never really lingers too much on a kill, or even just in general. It tends to kind of hop around a lot.
Yeah.
And I just absolutely love that. And there's just so much attention to detail.
Those stylized murders are a real trademark of Giallo as a genre, as a film genre. Those stylized kills, and I mean, obviously, Argento was a master of it. At this point, I can use a quote from another of my favorite Italian directors, Lucio Fulci, and he was once quoted and has been quoted many times as saying that violence is Italian art. And I think that is such a good way to sum up so much of Italian horror cinema.
That is an excellent quote. And the fascinating thing about a lot of the kills in Deep Red is they're tough to watch. They're really brutal, but they're also very beautiful and sort of choreographed and almost like a dance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's trademark Argento, right? I mean, it's so weird to say. It sounds so macabre to say that a murder scene is beautiful, but the way that he shoots them is fascinating and just the look, the feel, the music. I mean, I don't know. It's something else, man.
It's very artistic.
Yeah.
And something that I read, which I had no idea about, is that actually two of the kills in here inspired a couple kills from various films, including David Cronenberg's Scanners
Oh.
and also Halloween 2. Because there's the scalding water death in Halloween 2, and of
Yeah.
course, there's the scalding water death in Deep Red.
Wow, I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. I thought you were going somewhere else with that because famously, another giallo, Mario Bava's A Bay of Blood, which I mentioned earlier, sometimes called Twitch of the Death Nerve, is famous, for inspiring two of the kills in Friday the 13th Part 2, even though the creators of Friday the 13th Part 2 deny that.
I did not know that.
Yeah,
That is a fun fact.
A Bay of Blood is another really great movie, and obviously Bava, Fulci, and Argento are usually considered kind of the three big Italian horror directors, and Mario Bava being basically the godfather of Italian horror. A Bay of Blood is usually kind of given credit for sparking one of the movies that really sparked the slasher genre.
That's a film that I actually have not seen yet. So at some point, I need to get around to checking that one out.
It's rad, dude.
Did you have a favorite of the kills in this film?
Man, it's tough. It's really hard to pick. So first off, I won't say this is my favorite kill, but I just want to say you were given that great plot description earlier, and the opening of this movie is so great because it gives you exactly what you're going to get for the rest of the film. You get this like creepy, childlike singing. You see this knife murder happen in the shadows, and this knife falls to the ground dripping this bright red blood, and then a little kid steps up to it, and then bam, you go into the theme song by Goblin. I think that's great. It's not my favorite murder scene in the movie, but it is a great scene. But in terms of the murders, I'm really torn because I think that the murder of the psychiatrist slash parapsychologist, whose name is Giordani, I think that his murder is really interesting because of the creepy doll, which is obviously one of the most, and like a robot doll. It's really crazy, and that's one of the iconic images of this movie. Plus, his face just gets bashed in. Ouch! It hurts to watch. And then the other one is, and this is where the major spoilers come in, but when the final killer is revealed and she is killed, her head gets sliced off by her own necklace. It is, and then there's this long scene of you don't really, at least in the cut I saw, you don't really see her body. You just see the necklace drenched in blood, like going down this elevator after it has pulled the necklace through her neck and cut her head off. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think that is probably my favorite of the kills in this, just because I remember the first time I watched it, I was thinking, no, there's no way she's going to get decapitated by her own necklace that is caught in an elevator. Nope, that's exactly what's happening. And so Giordani's death was really weird to me. Every time I watch it almost feels slightly out of place because the whole animatronic creepy doll,
with no explanation, right? They don't ever explain that creepy animatronic doll.
No, it has no explanation. Why was that used? And he sort of seems mildly surprised by it, but it's sort of a mild shock. It's not, where the heck did this come from?
Yeah.
So was that something that he had? Did the killer bring that?
I mean, the killer would have had to bring it because the killer uses it to distract him so that he doesn't see her sneaking up on him.
Yeah, but that is a weird scene.
Very weird, but really effective. And I mean, that image of that creepy doll and its face, I can't say this for sure. This is just conjecture, but I have wondered whether that doll was the inspiration for the killer's mask in that movie Happy Death Day. Isn't that what it's called? The movie that came out a while back here in America. It's like kind of a meta slasher parody.
That is the name of it, and it looks exactly like that,
Yeah.
but I have no idea.
Me either. It just looks so much like it.
And so you mentioned the cut that you watched. Apparently, there are a bunch of different versions of this.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm not entirely sure which one I watched. I think the first time I watched it, I may have watched I think it was the Blue Underground version, which had like an uncensored English version.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, and you're right, there's multiple kinds, but the two main cuts are the Italian version, like the international version, and the US version. So the US version. So did you watch in your version? How long was yours, for one thing?
I think it was around 2 hours, and mine was entirely in Italian.
There you go. So you watched the
with
longer
English
cut.
subs. Yeah.
The version I got off of Amazon Prime is an hour and 40 minutes. It's had 26 minutes chopped out, which apparently Argento himself supervised those cuts, but back in the day. But so the English language version, which I watched, is only an hour and 44 minutes, and that's the other thing I was going to ask, because other versions have kept the English dubbing, but they've reinserted some of those missing shots, and so apparently some of the dubbing has been lost over time. So if you watch a longer version, sometimes with English, it'll drop into Italian just for certain scenes because that part of the dubbing has been lost. So that's the other way you can tell.
I think the first time I watched it was actually on one of those cuts, because I thought something was maybe going wrong with my Blu-ray player, and it was switching between audio tracks or something.
Yeah.
So I paused it and checked, and I was like, no, it's the right thing. It's just switching between English and Italian. And I did a quick Google search. This was the first time I watched it. So I guess I've seen multiple cuts of it before.
That's not uncommon with Argento's movies. I know that when I was watching Phenomena recently, or Phenomenon, I always forget if it's singular or plural, but I think it's Phenomenon. But when I was watching that, it kept switching back and forth between English and Italian, and I thought, what's going on? And apparently it's kind of the same thing. Some of the English dubbing's just been lost or was never recorded for some of the scenes that they later reinserted, because a lot of these Italian horror movies would arrive in the United States heavily cut.
Totally. And one thing you were saying about the opening to this film is it really does, in my mind, set that tone of the juxtaposition between this childlike innocence, and then this really intense brutality that kind of pervades throughout. And I kind of like that it continues, like you were saying, with the child's lullaby that precedes all of the murders.
Yeah.
It's really creative, and that stark contrast, I think, adds to the eeriness of the overall motion picture. And it has this kind of dreamlike, nightmarish tone, which I appreciate a lot. Even just kind of those random scenes where there would be toys or like dolls or like a little toy cradle that tips over, and the marbles knocking together.
Yeah, that's the one part. Well, not the one. That's one of the things in the movie that I wonder if it had a deeper significance in the longer version or something. Or was it just kind of creepy imagery to reveal that this person's insane? Because while I love those scenes, I don't know that I can ever figure out if what's going on in those scenes with the marbles and the cribs and the dolls and all that has any connection at all to the killer's backstory, or if it's just this person's a nut.
So I am not entirely sure. Having watched the longer cut, I don't think there's necessarily a concrete connection, but I just sort of interpreted it as a kid witnessing this murder and sort of, the playthings being upended.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, where, the marbles violently crashing together, the doll crib flipping over, like a doll swinging from the ceiling or whatever. So that kind of perversion of being a child.
Man, you did great with that.
Taken away.
You did great with that. I never considered that take on it. That's interesting.
Why, thank you.
Yeah.
So that was my interpretation. I'm glad you mentioned Phenomena. I haven't seen that one, but as I was watching Deep Red, one thing I was thinking of is, so we have the psychic Helga, and that kind of made me think of some of the other sort of supernatural things that occur in a lot of Argento's other films. And then it got me thinking of Stephen King and how a lot of his different books are kind of connected. And do you think Deep Red, Suspiria, some of those other Argento films all exist in the same universe?
Very interesting. So I would answer kind of yes and no. Like, I don't know if they actually exist in the same universe in the way that we have come to think of that now, like with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and things like that. I don't know that I think that they necessarily exist in that way. But earlier, I was reading an interview with Dario Argento, and the interviewer kept asking him about his process, and he would say they would always describe it in terms of this world that you have created. And Argento would answer questions like, yes, in the world that I am creating in my films. So I think in a way, they all take place in Argento world, right? Like, it's not really our world. It's the way that Argento chooses to view and portray the world. But I don't know that they exist, in a way that we would think about like a larger cinematic universe. But I definitely think that they exist in the world as Dario Argento chooses to portray it.
I like that. I like that take. Yeah, I'm trying to imagine now Argento's version of the Avengers,
Yeah, right.
and I'm not sure I want to imagine that.
Pretty messed up. Jennifer from Phenomena and maybe some of the chicks from Suspiria.
Oh, that'd be pretty messed up. I don't even know. Would they be the heroes, the villains?
I'm sure there will be plenty of twists and turns along the way. Some stylized murders and some dope music.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd watch it.
Oh, today I will watch it today.
So every time I watch Deep Red, I always end up forgetting at some point towards the middle of the film that Gianni and Marcus are not detectives.
Yeah, that's another trademark of the giallo genre, right? This sort of investigator who's not a cop, some sort of outsider. It's a lot of times they're expats, so a lot of times they're a British person, as in the case with Marcus, or they're an American, as is the case in Bird with Crystal Plumage. A lot of times they are musicians, writers, journalists, who do these investigations, and they're usually police involved. And this one, the police were very, very barely involved, to the point where I can't even remember the inspector's name. It's a long Italian name that starts with a C. But yeah, that's another trademark, is that outsider perspective.
And that's something that I always love about giallo films, is that trademark. And I particularly feel like it's well done in Deep Red, especially down to, like you were saying, the cops are barely in this, and then when they are, the lead detective is chowing down on a sandwich at the crime scene, or always has a cup of coffee in his hand.
Yep.
And it seems intentional to sort of posit the police in Deep Red as sort of the laughingstock.
Yeah, and they're not in all giallo, right? Like, if they might be running together in my head, but I'm pretty sure in Bird with the Crystal Plumage, the police inspector is much more involved in the investigation and much more competent. But yeah, in this one, I totally understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So I thought that was a nice twist on this, as opposed to other giallo films. And I feel like it was almost something similar in Tenebrae, which we watched that one together a while back.
Yeah, at the Carolina.
Yep. Because that's another one that I just absolutely love.
So good, man. It's so good.
It really just doesn't get old.
It has a lot of similarities in a lot of ways to this film, but I mean, they're definitely their own animal. But stylistically, I mean, you can really there's a lot of Argento in both of them.
Oh yes. So with that, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to keep talking about Deep Red.
You have killed. And you will kill again.
You're getting closer and closer to the most unnatural kind of death. Beyond shock.
What was that?
Beyond horror into total terror. Murder runs wild. Blood runs cold. Deep red.
The conjecture is that an act of bloodshed was once committed in that house.
What is it?
Didn't you hear that?
No, what was it?
I don't know.
Everywhere you look. Everywhere you turn. Death is running with you. Deep red. It'll put you into deep shock.
Hey guys, we are back and we are talking about In Deep Red.
Profundo Rosso.
And, you know, one thing that I just really love about this movie is the world building. And kind of like I was saying earlier, I just feel like it has a Stephen King kind of feel to it in the way that everything is very intentional. And there's just kind of a lot of weird stuff going on.
That, and I will say that for the benefit of the listener, that during the break, that sparked some Stephen King conversation between us, and I did want to mention just a quick shout out. Some friends of ours, since the last time we did an episode, some friends of ours have started up their own podcast based around Stephen King. A couple of our friends, Donnie and Tarl, who are probably the biggest Stephen King buffs that I know personally. Their podcast is called Stephen King Rules. I'm not sure exactly what all platforms it's on. I listen to it on iTunes, but people should check that out. They put a lot of work into it, and it's a really a good listen by some dudes who are super into Stephen King. Stephen King Rules podcast.
And as a massive Stephen King fan, I will 100% say if you're even a mild Stephen King fan, you got to check out the podcast.
I'm a mild Stephen King fan, and I enjoy it.
Yeah, whether you're into Stephen King books, film adaptations, whatever, that is a podcast that you got to check out. So a couple of the weird, just the really bizarre scenes in here. In Deep Red, one was the scene with the little girl where she's like stabbed a lizard.
Yeah, right. It's weird.
Yeah, it doesn't really seem to really go anywhere or have a purpose. Although I guess it sort of kind of ties into that whole idea of, the perversion of childhood.
Yeah.
But then there's also this one scene where it cuts to these two dogs fighting for about 30 seconds. I'm not sure if that was in the cut that you watched.
It's not in that cut. I was reading about that online. The dog fight is not in the version that I've seen.
And I think it's been in all the versions that I've seen. I've seen, I guess, probably 2 or 3 different versions. And it makes no sense to me because it just kind of cuts to that for about 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Or whatever, and then cuts away. And I always think maybe it will cut back to that. Nope, it doesn't. Just kind of stuck in.
Yeah, I don't know. I've not seen that. I'll say about the child though. I mean, I always hate to say like, well, the Italians, because I've never been to Italy. I'm not Italian. I don't know anything about Italy except for watching a lot of their movies. But a lot of these Italian horror movies and thrillers do feature children. I mean, a lot of times kind of creepy children. Lucio Fulci and the movies he did with, particularly with Dardano Sacchetti as the screenwriter, had a lot of children in it. And they presented it in various ways. Sometimes they would say, that the children are there because they see the world and they see adults for who they really are, and they see the darkness in the adults and things like that. But I think in this instance, you're onto something about that kind of, the loss of innocence through childhood and things like that.
Yeah, that's kind of the only connection I could really make to that. And then a couple other things that I think are absolutely hilarious and very strange about Deep Red are that it just seems like the entire thing is just there's just a lot of coincidence and kind of miraculously figuring things out. Like the way when Marcus visits the house in the country, and I'm blanking on the woman's name who was killed.
The author?
And he realizes that her hand was Amanda, and he realizes that her hand was pointing, and he finds that suspicious.
Dude, you know what I want to say about that scene? My dude bails on that corpse. Like, he just bails on that corpse. I love it. The next scene, he's talking to somebody, and I think he's talking to Giordani, and he's like, so do you think they found the body yet? And he's like, oh, I'm sure they have. Which basically just means he goes to this lady's house, finds her dead and scalded to death, and it's just like, whoop, I'm out of here, and doesn't call the police, doesn't do anything. He just bounces.
He probably should have called the police, but I mean, if he keeps showing up around dead bodies,
I mean, my dude just bails.
Oh, yeah. He was like, nope, not sticking around for this one.
But he has no sense of boundaries anyway. Like, he breaks into so many places in this movie. I guarantee you the landlord of that house, like the kind of mystery house that he keeps going to investigate, I guarantee you the landlord regrets the day he ever saw that guy. I mean, he breaks down the walls, he breaks out the windows. Eventually the whole place gets burned to the ground. I just feel so bad for that landlord. At the end, he's just sitting there like, well, do you think the ghosts did it?
Yeah, he had a blatant disregard for everything in this movie.
Yeah, no respect for other people's property.
None whatsoever. So we were talking a little bit earlier about the music, the soundtrack by Goblin, and also that kind of lullaby motif that plays throughout before all the kills. And I was kind of curious. I want to talk about the music a little bit, and I was curious what you thought about the score as well as that kind of lullaby melody that plays, and how this compares to other Goblin soundtracks, other Giallo soundtracks, and just other of your favorite movie soundtracks.
My friend, what I think about the score for this movie is that it is amazing. I mean, like, the score for this movie is a masterpiece, and it's such an interesting development, really, in horror film scoring. I mean, it's just so influential. So if you watch Gialli, and if you watch, we haven't really talked about the term Giallo really this whole time. I mean, I think we're assuming that listeners will know what a Giallo is, but maybe some of the listeners won't. Before we talk about soundtracks, should we talk about what a Giallo is a little bit?
Yeah, that's probably not a bad idea.
I just thought of that. Like, I don't want to break into like the history of like music for Gialli without explaining what they are. So, Giallo is a distinctly Italian film genre, and really it refers to a specific type of mystery film. The word Giallo comes from these pulp mystery novels that were popular in Italy that had yellow covers, Giallo being the Italian word for yellow. And so that word just kind of became synonymous for Italians with a mystery or whodunit story. And then the Giallo film genre, that's just basically a distinctly Italian form of mystery film. We've already talked a little bit about some of what sets it apart. It's usually very stylized. It relies on a lot of stylized kill scenes. Typically, your protagonist is an outsider of some kind, whether that be an expat or somebody who's not a police officer investigating. A lot, basically the origins of that genre can be traced back to Mario Bava and some of Mario Bava's films, like The Girl Who Knew Too Much, and distinctly Blood and Black Lace, which I also watched for the first time recently. And there is a huge influence from Blood and Black Lace on this movie for sure. Another thing about Giallo is that a lot of times the killer was dressed in a very distinctive way, black leather gloves, usually black, or in this case, brown raincoat, kind of a floppy hat to disguise their identity. So yeah, it's a little bit about Giallo. I just didn't want to keep talking about it if maybe the listeners didn't know about it.
Yeah, no, I think it was a good idea to give a little bit of a history. Yeah, a history of Giallo. And if you're at all familiar with slasher films, but not familiar with Giallo, you'll notice if you start watching a lot of similarities between the two.
For sure. And I already mentioned A Bay of Blood earlier, but also John Carpenter is with Halloween basically kind of kickstarted the whole slasher genre, and he's a huge Argento fan and a huge Mario Bava fan. So John Carpenter's been very open about the influence that Giallo films had on his work.
Yeah, and especially if you go back to, like you were saying, the original Halloween, you can totally see that influence, because if you think about it, the two primary investigators are sort of Loomis and Laurie.
Yeah.
Right. And neither of them are the police at all. They sort of insert themselves in there.
And another thing that I think it's pretty safe to say he probably took influence from, or maybe not, but it just seems like a big coincidence if not, if in Blood and Black Lace, the killer is dressed very similar to how the killer is dressed in Deep Red, with the raincoat, the black gloves, the big hat, but also the killer in Blood and Black Lace wears a solid white mask, right? So that seems very reminiscent of the Michael Myers mask to me. So yeah, definitely a big influence on the later slasher phenomenon.
Definitely. And I don't think this is Giallo, but it was one of the earliest slasher films, and definitely has a strong Giallo vibe, which was Alice, Sweet Alice.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I think we actually met for the first time at a screening of that, didn't we?
Indeed, sir. Alice, Sweet Alice in Pieces.
Oh,
yep, sure did.
That was a special screening.
Indeed. It was the first time I ever saw Pieces, but would not be the last time.
No. In fact, we watched that recently, which was kind of a blast.
Virtual movie night. But yeah, I don't want to duck your question about the scores, because I really want to talk about film scores. But I just wanted to we kept talking about Giallo, and I wanted to make sure that we kind of explain that a little bit for the people at home.
Conspiracy theory, that was just so that you could have a little delay and write down your favorite film scores.
Joke's on you. I wrote them down earlier today in anticipation of this question. But yeah, so you're talking about the music in this movie, and I'll say, so this was Goblin's first, but definitely not last, collaboration with Argento. Before this, kind of there was a lot of Italian composers that worked with Giallo films, but Ennio Morricone, who is a super famous Italian movie composer, had done a lot of scores, including Argento's earlier films like Bird with the Crystal Plumage and Cat o' Nine Tails. Ennio Morricone had done the scores for those, and they were more classic symphonic scores. And then with this one, it's like you said earlier, man, they really took it up a notch. So he got Goblin to score this movie. He had originally wanted, and I wrote the name down, and I'm going to destroy it, Giorgio Gasolini. He had wanted to compose the film, and he had composed it, and then Argento did not like what he submitted. So he just kind of stumbled across Goblin. They were this upstart prog rock band who were trying to make it as just a prog rock group. And he asked them if they would score it. They had something like 4 days to write the score for this film, and movie history was made.
History was made indeed. And I think I recall the entire film was shot over something like 6 weeks.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's wild.
I think that's correct. Which is really remarkable when you think about the lasting power that this movie has had.
Yeah, for sure.
And one thing that I think is really fascinating about this that you can really tell is this was an early Goblin soundtrack because
Yeah.
it's absolutely masterful. It's got that kind of avant-garde prog rock vibe to it, but it definitely has some, especially in spots, a sort of raw ruggedness to it, which really resonates with me. I absolutely love it.
Oh, same. Yeah. It's distinct from other Goblin scores, really. Like, it sounds a lot different. Like you said, you can tell it's earlier, and that ruggedness probably comes from writing it. I want to say, I don't quote me, but I do want to say it was something like 4 days that they had to write the score for this movie. I mean, that's insane. To write a soundtrack this influential in 4 days. It's crazy.
Yeah, a lot of I think a lot of groups couldn't write something that wonderful in 4 weeks or even 4 months.
Yeah, it's
So
insane.
I think that really shows their prowess, and it's probably one of the reasons that Argento, like you were saying, went on to become such a frequent collaborator with them.
Oh yeah, for sure. And he would constantly talk about what a big part of his movies their music was. I mean, he's not ashamed to talk about how much he loves Goblin, and he's done a lot of work with Claudio Simonetti, their keyboard player, synthesizer player specifically.
Yeah, because one of the big things about Deep Red and a lot of Argento's films is that music played such a key role. And in this case, there's of course that lullaby sequence that plays before the actual murders, but then oftentimes, like we were talking about earlier with a lot of the kills, how they seem very orchestrated and kind of dance like. The music not only sets a tone and kind of will induce anxiety or suspense, but it almost is sort of like a musical backdrop for a ballet that you're seeing transpire. A very gruesome ballet, but kind of a dance number.
A crazy ballet too. I mean, this every time the music would come on in this movie, I would think this music sounds manic. I mean, it sounds like it's just insane. The way that you had worded it, and maybe in the show notes that I saw earlier, where was you had asked, do I think the music fits the movie? And I think it does. I don't imagine that this movie would be at all what it is without the music, but at the same time, it sounds so different than if you watched other movies from the period that it's jarring almost, but in a way that drives the plot and drives just the insanity that's going on. It's just so manic sounding.
Absolutely. And it sort of mimics the unhinged killer a little bit.
Yeah.
And yeah, it totally does that. And I think it lends a much needed anxiety to the movie, and it really makes the movie.
In a similar way that, people talk about the importance of the score on John Carpenter's Halloween. All accounts say that when that movie first screened without the music, people just didn't find it all that frightening. And then when John Carpenter, himself a huge fan of Argento's movies, put the music to it, it just totally changed the whole film. It's insane what a good score can do for a film.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who recognize the Halloween theme song, but they have not actually seen the movie. So I think that just goes to show how important music can be to a film. Goblin composed the score for a lot of different Argento films, including Suspiria.
Yep.
Do you have a favorite Goblin soundtrack?
Yeah, I mean, and I can't sit here and claim that I've listened extensively to all their soundtracks, but I've listened to quite a few. I think of all the ones that I've listened to, Tenebrae is probably my favorite. I think most people consider Suspiria kind of their masterpiece, but there's something wild about Tenebrae, which, to be fair, is not. I guess it's not officially a Goblin score. It's credited to 3 of the members of Goblin. They had broken up, and then they got back together with Sans drummer to write the score for Tenebrae. But it's just. Tenebrae is this weird mix of like synth rock, prog rock, and disco in just a really I don't know, man. I can listen to the soundtrack for Tenebrae over and over and over, and it's just so good. Like just on its own as an album, it's so good.
That is one that I think I'm going to have to give another listen to at some point because I've only seen Tenebrae one time. It was when we watched it, and I think that was the only time I heard the score, but I remember absolutely loving it then. I think if I had to say a favorite Goblin soundtrack, it might be Suspiria. I also love Dawn of the Dead.
Yeah, man.
I mean, I think
Absolutely.
everyone does. But I also might give it to Deep Red just because it sounds so unique. And the thing is, pretty much every Goblin soundtrack does sound ridiculously unique,
Yeah, they're all so different.
incredibly different. I mean, I don't know how they were able to achieve that sound, which was recognizable. It was at once recognizable, but also different.
I think they were just musical explorers, right? Like if you look into them, they were just constantly exploring music. They weren't trying to like pin themselves down. I mean, Claudio Simonetti, especially, I've listened to a lot of his scores that he did on his own too, and he just was constantly expanding his palette. And I mean, he keeps his personal voice, but he just constantly brings in new elements to make each score different. And it's just really it's fascinating. It's like you said, you can always recognize that they're involved, but at the same time, it's always unique and new.
100%. And then I know you like a lot of other soundtracks and composers. So where does Goblin fall when compared to some of your non-Goblin favorite film scores?
I think I'd put Goblin in my top 3 film. You're talking not just horror films, you're talking overall films. Everything.
Yeah, overall.
I think I'd probably still put them really high. Once you break it up into overall, not just horror, it kind of makes it a little more difficult because then I got to bring in your Basil Poliodorus's and your Ennio Morricone's, even though he did a lot of work in horror too. But I think I would probably still put them top 3. Just the first thing that comes to my mind, and once again, most of these are people who work primarily, or not primarily, but a lot in horror. I would put Fabio Frizzi probably at the top. Something about Fabio Frizzi's scores just really has always drawn me in, and I know I'm not alone in that. Especially his score for like The Beyond and Zombie 2 and things like that. There's just something wild about him. And people say they're kind of goblin-esque in a way, and maybe they were, but they're definitely Frizzi. I would put John Carpenter up there, obviously. I mean, the man. And I would put Goblin up there as well. And then I already mentioned, people like Basil Poliodorus and Ennio Morricone, and like, I also really like Harold Faltermeyer, like Axel F. and from Beverly Hills Cop. He did the Fletch theme song and things like that. Those are great themes too.
I forgot he did the Fletch theme song. Yeah, I would have to put him up there. I absolutely love the Axel F theme song. Because I mean, the whole Beverly Hills Cop soundtrack to me is delightful.
Oh,
I also love Jerry Goldsmith. Pretty much anything he touched to me was gold. Like Alien. I love his Warlock soundtrack. I definitely have to have Goblin up there, and John Carpenter. I mean, pretty much, again, anything he touched was gold. And the neat part about him is a lot of his soundtracks, like Goblin, kind of sounded the same. They were recognizable. You could tell it was John Carpenter, but they also were pretty unique. Like the Halloween soundtrack sounds nothing like the Big Trouble in Little China soundtrack.
Yeah. I'm struck by Carpenter in a lot of ways because he's openly simplistic in his writing style. He openly strives for simplicity. He will admit to not being a super technical musician. Like Claudio Simonetti on the keyboards is a wild man, but John Carpenter will admit to being a pedestrian musician, but he's just a genius composer, and he has mastered the art of simplicity. Like you can listen to John Carpenter themes over, and they're among the most popular movie themes of all time. I mean, everybody knows something of John Carpenter's, but this is just a guy who was doing it he was writing music because he loves music, but also to save money. and just using whatever equipment he had and whatever he could do on his own to make a lot of these scores. It was wild. It's crazy to think about just the mastery of simplicity like that.
Yeah, his were always just very bare bones. And a couple of my other favorite composers, I love James Horner, although pretty much all of his soundtracks kind of sound the same
Sure.
in a lot of ways. He just goes all in on that timpani. And then I love Alan Silvestri, who to me is absolutely hilarious because he's gotten really big and he's done stuff like Avengers Endgame and Captain America: The First Avenger, and he did Forrest Gump. But unless I'm mistaken, I think he also did the soundtrack for Mac and Me.
Interesting. I always love the things like that don't seem like they match up with the rest of their repertoire.
And I just looked that up on IMDb. I confirmed it. Yeah. So in 1988, some of the films he did: Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Mac and Me, My Stepmother is an Alien.
Whoa.
And then, of course, in '89, he did the Abyss. He did Back to the Future Part 2. In 1990, he did Back to the Future Part 3. But it just cracks me up seeing sandwiched in there between Who Framed Roger Rabbit and The Abyss and Back to the Future Part 2, Mac and Me.
Man's got to make a living. I just
right.
I just thought of a couple more as well. I was looking down at my little list of top 5 soundtracks that I came up with earlier, just in case we were to start talking about this, and I realized that neither of us have said John Williams.
Oh shit! Yeah, I mean John Williams. God, what a genius! Like Star Wars, Indiana Jones,
Jaws.
Oh,
The Jaws theme, man. I was thinking a lot about it recently. The Jaws score and just John Williams, man. What a great composer. And then jumping from John Williams, who everybody knows, to a person that maybe not as many people know, I'm going to throw a little love to my dude, George S. Clinton. Not Parliament Funkadelic George Clinton, but George S. Clinton, who scored movies like American Ninja 2 and American Ninja 3, I'm pretty sure, and things like that. Those, honestly, man, I love a good cheesy 80s soundtrack. And those American Ninja soundtracks that George S. Clinton did, and also he did Avenging Force as well. I could listen to those soundtracks over and over again. They're super rare to get in physical media, unfortunately, but man, I love them.
yeah. He's had a really interesting career, like Alan Silvestri as well, because he also did Austin Powers: The Spy Who Shagged Me and Austin Powers: Goldmember. He did Mortal Kombat, which I actually love. The first Mortal Kombat movie. I thought that was really good. And yeah, like you were saying, he also did a bunch of those just super 80s movies like American Ninja. So
And that's that stuff
he's
I
had a cool
love.
career.
Yeah, I love those movies though. Every time I listen to I watch the American Ninja movies, I get pumped on that music, man. He did such a great job.
Yeah. He's a good one. That was a good sleeper pick. And then Christopher Young. I forgot to mention him earlier, but he did the Hellraiser films, which I absolutely love. And I think it was like Simon Boswell or something like that. I think did the Lord of Illusion soundtrack. But if you look on the original one sheet, it has Christopher Young because he composed part of it, and then Boswell came in and did the rest.
That's always interesting arrangements like that.
Yeah.
Another go ahead.
Oh no, that was it.
Another dude, while we're throwing out every composer under the sun, but let's just keep talking about all these composers we love. Harry Manfredini and his Friday the 13th score is amazing. I love that. It's a lot different. Like if you listen to the Friday the 13th score, a lot of these ones, well, not all of them, but like Goblin and Fabio Frizzi and even John Carpenter, like they're almost like songs, like they're like recognizable songs. Whereas Manfredini and Friday the 13th, it's like almost like just a mood going the whole time. It's not necessarily recognizable songs, except maybe the theme song. It's just sort of a mood, and then occasional like stabbing notes and things. It's great. I met him at a con several years ago, and he was just a really nice, like humble dude. It was a real treat to get to meet him. His music, is a defining aspect of those Friday the 13th films for me.
And his scores were really unique.
Oh yeah. Everybody. That's another thing that everybody knows, though. That's a thing that everybody knows, whether you're into horror or not. People know what you're talking about when you do that.
Yep. Yeah, people who mistakenly believed that Jason was the killer in the first Friday, they still know.
Spoiler.
I thought we were cool to talk about spoilers on the
No,
show.
I'm just kidding.
And speaking of which, one thing that I really want to touch on, which we haven't gotten to really delve into, is I want to talk a little bit about the ending of Deep Red and the final reveal of the killer.
Yeah.
Because I remember the first time I watched this, I was absolutely shocked at finding out that the killer is
Dun dun dun.
Carlo's mom. So Marcus's friend Carlo, you find out that it was actually his mother, and it's sort of explained that she there had some sort of mental thing going on, and her husband was going to, I think, kind of have her locked away.
Yeah.
And so she didn't want any part of that and decided she would kill him. So you find out that the intro scene that you see with the small child witnessing a murder and the bloody knife is Carlo witnessing his mother killing his father. And I remember I had no idea about that twist. I thought it was one of the best concealed twists in any film that I've seen, giallo or not.
But you know what's really genius about it, and I didn't really pay attention until this second watch, is that while it is such an ingenious twist, and like you said, you don't really see it coming, it's not in any way a cheat like in some movies, because you see her face for a flash at the first of the movie. You see it, but it's so quick that unless you pause it, you don't know what you just saw. You are just like Marcus in that you don't know that you just saw the killer's face for a flash. So it's right there in front of you if you knew what you're looking for. I love it.
Totally. And I on my first watch of this movie, I actually, after I think when the final credits started rolling, I actually went to the DVD menu, went to scene selection, and navigated to that scene. And I sure enough, I paused it and realized you can see her face right there. It's not actually hidden. It's just that you're oblivious to it.
It's so fast.
Marcus.
It's so fast. And then the whole rest of the movie, he's like, I'm missing something. And I love it because it's something that you could have seen. Just like him, he could have seen it, and so could you. But you're in the same position he is. You didn't know to look for it, and neither did he. But it was there for you if you did. I think that's so great. I just think I was so struck by that this time watching it.
Absolutely. And kind of circling back to something I said earlier, I think that really hammers home how well Deep Red kind of places you as the viewer into the film. And so you're trying to figure out who the killer was the whole time. And also, I think a lot of the kind of camera work where it doesn't just focus on the murder that's going on, or it doesn't just focus on kind of the killer sneaking across the rooftop or something. It'll focus on these different details the same way that our eye movement works, and the way that if there's something undesirable going on, like someone getting murdered, we will avert our eyes or look elsewhere. So yeah, I really think this movie's very immersive.
Yeah, it's really, I don't know, man. I guess I'm just heaping a lot of praise on this movie, but I think it just deserves it. It's just such a masterpiece, and a lot of people agree that it's, if not the best, it's among the best giallo ever made.
I would absolutely agree with that statement. One thing that I was curious about, though, upon watching this again, was if this were remade, or if it were made for the first time today, how do you think it would be received, and what do you think would be different about it?
So I think that in a way, gialli are so distinctly Italian. I mean, with the exception, and there have been movies made in other countries that were influenced by them. Most notably, I guess, De Palma's Dress to Kill, which I will confess I've not seen, but most people list in lists of, non-Italian giallo, if such a thing exists. But giallo they're just so Italian that I don't know how it would be changed. If it were made outside of the country of Italy. Now, if it were made inside of Italy, and there are still some gialli being made today, but it's just not nearly as many. I don't know. I think I'm rambling on that, but I don't know how it will be changed, and I don't know how it will be received, because when I first read about Giallo films, I was a little hesitant to watch them because the descriptions of them all made them sound like they were going to be very lurid and very. It's not that I mind gore. I'm a big Lucio Fulci fan, but just sometimes if something's lurid for the sake of being lurid, I'm not interested. But these movies are not that. They are stylish and artful, but at the same time, you could imagine that level of violence would have been shocking to people at the time. Whereas now, when everybody in America, mainstream audiences, watch Game of Thrones and stuff like that, that level of violence doesn't shock us anymore. I don't know what that says about our society, but so nowadays, I don't know. I almost want to say that they would not up the violence, that they would maybe keep it subtle. They would probably play more into the mystery and the crime aspect of it, I think, in a modern audience than they would into the violence and things like that. I think it would play as more of a mystery, a murder mystery film, than any kind of horror element nowadays.
That's what I would definitely hope. Although I could also see this going the complete opposite route and going all in on the gratuitous gore, kind of the gore porn route. Although I would hope it would go more with the sort of mystery thriller kind of vibe.
And of course, Argento would probably hate it if it were remade. He, in interviews, was openly opposed to a Suspiria remake.
Well, that's actually what kind of got me thinking about if this had a remake, how would it be? Because we actually watched the Suspiria remake together.
Yeah.
When it came out, and going in, I tried to kind of reserve any judgment or kind of preconceived notions, because Suspiria is a film that is very near and dear to my heart. The film itself, the soundtrack, and I was kind of curious how it could even be remade. And I think the remake kind of paid homage to that, but also kind of went its own route. So it definitely had some similarities, but I think it made a lot of necessary changes, like swapping the very colorful, the very vibrant color palette in the original Suspiria for a very drab, but still exciting and entertaining color palette. Even switching up the music, so it was, I think, Tom York did the score for that.
Tom York, yeah.
And it also, I think, delved into the kind of the lore of the witches a lot more, whereas Argento's Suspiria didn't. I mean, it sort of touched upon the history of them, but it didn't really go beyond that. And that's really got into the politics of the witches and actually kind of showed them a lot more.
What you just said brought up two things that I want to talk about that are not necessarily connected, but I'm going to throw them both in right now. One of them is I totally agree with what you were just saying about the stylistic changes for the Suspiria remake. You liked it, right? You enjoyed the Suspiria remake.
I loved it. I loved the original Suspiria. I loved the
did.
remake.
I
loved
thought it
it
was
in
great
different
too.
ways. Yeah.
But I like what you were just saying, because you're right. Like they didn't try to be Argento. They didn't try to be Argento. They took, like you say, almost a totally opposite route with the kind of exchanging all the bright colors for the drab colors. You would have to get a musical genius like Tom York to write a score for a Suspiria remake following up on Goblin's music. You'd have to get a genius composer like Tom York. I think that was a great choice. So that's what I wanted to say there, is that it wasn't trying to be Argento. It was trying to be its own thing. And I really thought it was great when we watched it. The other thing I wanted to throw in, you were talking about the history of the witches and made me think this. So one thing we haven't even talked about is Daria Nicolodi, or however you say her last name, Nicolodi, as Gianna in Deep Red, who I thought she was amazing in this movie, by the way. In Deep Red, I thought she was great. Now, she was Dario Argento's long-term girlfriend, long-term partner, mother of Asia Argento, his daughter. They met in the casting for Deep Red, and they would, they didn't marry or anything, but they were together for many years. And she apparently was heavily involved in helping him write Suspiria. She was sort of into occultism. She had a grandmother who had a similar experience about going to some piano school and finding out that there were there was black magic being practiced there or something crazy like that. It was apparently based on a story from her grandmother's past. But Daria Nicolodi apparently was heavily involved in helping write all that stuff for Suspiria.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I didn't
That
until recently. Yeah,
That is a very fun fact. And
yeah,
interestingly, it was actually Helga being a psychic that sort of got me thinking about that question I asked earlier of whether this deep red exists in the same universe as Suspiria or something like that. Just because I feel like there was always in a lot of Argento films, there was usually some kind of supernatural thing going on,
yeah.
especially in it was the Three Mothers trilogy,
Right.
which I absolutely love that trilogy. How many have you seen all of those?
Only Suspiria. I've never seen Inferno, which I recently learned that Inferno was a huge influence on John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness. And I was reading an interview with Carpenter, and he was talking about how Inferno was such a big influence on Prince of Darkness. And I've definitely never seen the Third Mother. What's it called here? Mother of Tears or something like that? I think in Italy it's just called the Third Mother.
Yeah, it's called Mother of Tears.
Yeah. Claudio Simonetti did the score for that one, I think, of Goblin.
Yep, you were correct, and it was. I think it was Keith Emerson who did
Yeah,
Inferno.
You're right. You're right about that.
Yeah, which that's a really interesting score. And I love Inferno. I still think of the Three Mothers trilogy. My favorite is Suspiria, but Inferno is a very close second.
I really want to watch it. It's on Prime right now, and I really want to watch it. I have just the trailer. It showed after we saw Tenebrae at that screening, and the trailer really hooked me in, and that song really hooked me in. It's funny that apparently Keith Emerson's score was not well received at the time, because I think that at least that theme song is great.
Yeah, I'm surprised that it wasn't well received at the time, because it's definitely one of my favorite soundtracks.
He's following up on Goblin and Suspiria, and I think a lot of people probably just wanted more of Goblin, and what they got was Keith Emerson. You know?
Yeah, I mean, you got to look at it as its own entity, because if
Right.
you compare everything to Goblin scores, and especially Goblin's Suspiria
Right.
score, you're going to be disappointed.
For sure. I mean, it's, most people regard as their masterpiece.
Yeah. So you want to rate this bad boy?
Yes, I do.
All right.
All right.
I'm going to let you go first.
All right. In the past 2 times I've been on the show, I've struggled a little bit with my rating. I'm not struggling with today's rating. This is a 5-star movie, easily 5-star movie for me. It's a masterpiece, start to finish. Love it.
5 stars.
5
That's
stars.
that's a bold claim, and
Masterpiece.
you know, I gotta say, this is getting 5 stars for me.
Yeah.
I really actually thought very hard and tried to take a star off for something. And I'm not going to say it's necessarily a perfect film throughout. I think there's some kind of weird spots in it, like pinning the lizard or like the dog fight. But I think that's the beauty of this movie, and what makes it so fascinating to watch is that, and gives it so much replay value. There's so many details to take in, whether they're audio, visual, or the combined effect. And watching it multiple times, like we touched upon earlier, you pick up on a lot of clues to who the killer is that you didn't pick up on the first time you watched it. So yeah, I absolutely love this movie. It is incredibly exciting. It's very immersive, and I even think it kind of goes beyond just being a film, and I think it is an experience.
Yeah, it's just a beautiful film. The cinematography is great. The music, which we've raved about to no end, is a masterpiece. I mean, Goblin, Argento, I love this movie. If you can't, I loved this movie, and it really opened the door for me to wanting to get more into giallo films. And since then, I've watched several other of Argento's. I've watched some of Bava. I've watched some of Fulci, who I love Fulci's horror films, but I'd never really watched his giallo. And I watched Don't Torture a Duckling recently, and I plan to watch The Psychic, Seven Notes in Black. It's a little harder to come by. But yeah, it really threw me into this whole world of giallo films, and I love it. But you know who didn't? Oh, go ahead. Don't torture.
Oh, Don't Torture a Duckling is one that I've actually been meaning to watch.
Not anything like Deep Red by any means. Fulci was different than Argento. Fulci seemed a lot less fun in a lot of ways than Argento, even though I think that Fulci's horror movies are a blast, like Zombie. But it's a very different film with a very different feel than Deep Red. Don't Torture a Duckling is very different. But you know who didn't agree with us on our love of Deep Red? The New York Times review at the time. I wrote down a couple choice nuggets from the New York Times review, which claimed that it was a bucket of axe murder movie cliches, which, had I read that, I would have instantly wanted to see the film, I'm going to be honest. And that he called Dario Argento a director of incomparable incompetence.
Did we watch the same movie, New York Times?
I have no idea. I have no idea. Apparently, most reviews. I mean, Deep Red was very successful. Apparently, most reviews agreed that it was a great movie, but at least for its genre. But apparently, this reviewer in New York Times, whose name I didn't write down, probably good because I don't want to spit on their work, but did not agree with us.
That is shocking. I mean, if anything, I think the kills in here are very unique. I don't think
Very
it's
unique.
I don't think it's just a bucket of cliches.
A
I
bucket
think
of axe murder movie cliches.
whew, them's are some harsh words right there.
Very.
Wow. That's a brutal review.
A brutal review, yes, sir.
Whew. Well, don't listen to that. Listen to the Celluloid Fiends, and if you've already seen this movie, go watch it again. If you haven't seen this movie, well, we kind of spoiled it, but go watch it right now.
Still worth watching. It's like watching it's like watching art.
Exactly. It is definitely like watching art. So thank you again, Wes, for joining us, and tell the good people where they can follow you.
I'm on Instagram at Cliff Weston. You can check out my webpage for my writing at wdclifton.wordpress.com. I write under the name W.D. Clifton. By the way, I didn't mention earlier, frontiertales.com is where my story, Don't Cheat the Hangman, will be coming out in July. Go read it, and hey, why don't you throw a vote for me for the best story in that issue. And then, well, if you like it, if you don't, vote for somebody else. And then finally, if you want to listen to some music from long ago in my past, you can check out my old punk band Brentwood at brentwood.bandcamp.com for free.
Heck yeah, I'm definitely checking out both of those. You can follow us at Celluloid Fiends on Facebook and Twitter, and at Celluloid Fiends Pod on Instagram, which Wes just set up for us. So thank you very much for that.
No problemo.
If you want to follow me, you can check me out at Mitchell C. Long on Twitter and Instagram. You can read my writing on film at cupofmo.com, and you can check out my reviews and tutorials in the tech space at techuplife.com. And if you haven't already done so, head over to your favorite podcast source. We're on iTunes, we're on Google Podcasts, we're on Spotify, and go ahead and subscribe, as well as give us a rating and leave us a review, because it really helps us out. All right. Thanks for listening, and don't do anything I wouldn't do, which leaves you a pretty wide berth.
Stop it, please. For God's sake, please stop it. There's no more time. You've got to... Please, stop it. Stop it now. Turn it off. Turn it off. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it.